kunyari kayo and then gently suggest, ganun na lang. Magpa-brief lang kung ano ang status ng case. Kasi
I will just talk to Rosette and just check how
bigyan ka ng copy ng
it's okay, but you just find it a little too detailed. Yung ba yung
malaman, bakit yung particular issues na yun ang inaano niya? Kasi one of the issues are these benefits taxable? Nag-enumerate siya, pero hindi lahat. Ngayon, yung iba din.
mga foreigners?
Taga New Zealand yan. Meron silang member of parliament na Filipino. Isa yata na yun. Ano ba dyan? Ladies and gentlemen, let us all rise for the arrival of the Honorable Senate President and the Senators of the Republic of the Philippines.
Asan si Joel? Joel. Go player. The 44th session of the Senate in the first regular session of the 18th Congress is hereby called to order. Senator Joel Villanueva will lead the chamber in prayer.
Tayo po'y manalangin, dakilang Diyos, Ama naming sumasalangit, Diyos na may gawa ng langit at lupa, kami po ay lumalapit at naninikluhod sa iyo, humihingi ng kapatawaran, anumang kasalanan sa isip, sa salita at sa gawa. Hugasan niyo po kami ng iyong banal na dugo na nabuhos sa krus ng Kalbaryo at damitan mo kami ng damit ng katwiran upang makalapit sa iyo. Inilalapit po namin ang aming mga kababayan, lalo na ang mga biktima ng nag-alborotong Bulkang Taal. Yakapin mo po sila ng iyong pagmamahal, tulungan, at maging ang aming pamahalaan para matulungan at mabigyan ng tamang tulong para makabangon ang aming mga kababayan. Tulungan niyo rin po ang bawat isa sa amin dito sa Senado sa paggawa ng aming tungkulin at higit sa lahat, magampanan po namin ang aming responsibilidad bilang iyong mga lingkod para po sa aming minamahal na bayang Pilipinas. Sa iyo po ang lahat ng papuri at pasasalamat at maingat po namin ibinabalik ang lahat ng papuri at pasasalamat. Sa tanging pangalan po ng aming Panginoong Yesus, ang lahat po'y makiisa at magsabing Amen.
Amen. The Secretary, please call the roll.
Roll call of members, the Honorable Senators Angara, Binay, Cayetano, De Lima, De La Rosa, Drilon, Gatchalian, Go, Gordon, Ontiveros, Lacson, Lapid, Marcos, Pacquiao, Pangilinan, Pimentel, Poe, Recto, Revilla, Tolentino, Villanueva, Villar, Zubiri, Senate President Soto III.
With 19 senators present, the chair declares the presence of a quorum. Majority Leader.
Interpolate it today. Okay. Thank you, Mr. President. Before we take up official business, we'd like to greet our colleague, Senator Ronald Bato de la Rosa. A very happy birthday, Mr. President. You can see from his outfit that it is a special day today.
Yes.
Nagpaburga po ng barong for his birthday.
Happy birthday, Senjen, Senator General Bato de la Rosa. The chair declares a 1-minute suspension to greet Senator de la Rosa. Session resumed.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, we have very special guests in the gallery today. We have with us the New Zealand Opposition Party delegation headed by Honorable Simon Bridges, leader of the National Party. We have also with us the Honorable Jerry Brownie, Shadow Leader of the House of Representatives, member of the Ilam National Party. Honorable Mark Mitchell, member of the Rodney National Party, and Honorable Paulo Garcia, district member of National Party. The only Filipino in the National Assembly. Wow, what a feat, Mr. President. And of course, Ambassador Strachan is with them as well, the ambassador to the Philippines, the New Zealand ambassador. I'd like to welcome them, Mr. President.
Yes, we welcome all our guests from New Zealand to the Philippine Senate. Thank you for joining us this afternoon.
I've had a wonderful experience of visiting New Zealand, Mr. President, and celebrated New Year's there 3 years ago in Auckland. And I must say their country is a beautiful country, Mr. President. Very beautiful country indeed.
Also, there are very delicious agricultural products.
Yes, especially sheep, well, basically lamb and milk that we drink. Actually, a lot of our milk comes from New Zealand, Mr. President, and butter. Together with also the other guests in the gallery, we have Greco Belgica and Company of the Anti-Corruption Commission. We also have with us the mother of our distinguished former Senate President Pimentel. Tita Bing Pimentel is with us as well.
All right, welcome to all our guests to the Senate this
And
afternoon.
finally,
Thank
Mr.
you.
President, we also have students from Our Lady of the Abandoned Catholic School, Muntinlupa, are also here with us.
Welcome to the students. Thank you.
Mr. President, I move that we dispense with the reading of the journal of the 43rd session, Monday, January 20, 2020. Consider the same as approved.
Any objection? Chair hears none. Motion is approved. The journal is approved.
Mr. President, we do have a lot of things to take up after the reference of business, but we need to go for or proceed with the reference of business, Mr. President, to be able to take up these matters. So I move, Mr. President, to proceed with the reference of business.
The Secretary will proceed with the reference of business.
Reference of business, bills on first reading. Senate number 1264, entitled An Act Promoting Integrated Urban Agricultural Development in All Metropolitan Areas Nationwide to Address Food Security Concerns and Appropriating Funds Therefore, introduced by Senator Revilla Jr.
Referred to the Committees on Agriculture, Food and Agrarian Reform and the Committee on Finance.
Senate Number 1265, an act regulating the donation and transplantation of human organs and tissues from living donors, introduced by Senator Revilla Jr.
Referred to the Committees on Health and Demography and Finance.
Senate Number 1266, an act strengthening meaningful youth participation in local governance and further amending Republic Act Number 10742, otherwise known as the Sangguniang Kabataang Reform Act of 2015, introduced by Senator Revilla Jr.
Referred to the Committees on Youth, Local Government and Finance.
Senate Number 1267, an act increasing the monthly social pension of senior citizens, expanding the coverage thereof, and introduced by Senator Revilla Jr.
To the Committees on Social Justice and Finance.
Senate Number 1268, an act simplifying the confirmation of imperfect titles, amending for the purpose Presidential Decree Number 1529, Commonwealth Act Number 141, and Republic Act Number 9176, and for other purposes, introduced by Senator Angara.
Referred to the Committee on Justice and Human Rights.
Senate Number 1269, an act amending Republic Act Number 11232, otherwise known as an act providing for the revised Corporation Code of the Philippines and for other purposes, introduced by Senator Marcos.
Referred to the Committees on Constitutional Amendments, Trade and Finance.
Senate Number 1270, an act amending Section 2 of Republic Act Number 10868, otherwise known as the Centenarians Act of 2016, and for other purposes, introduced by Senator De Lima.
Referred to the Committees on Social Justice and Finance.
Senate Number 1271, an act regulating the use of mobile phones and other electronic gadgets to students from kindergarten to senior high school in all public and private schools, introduced by Senator De Lima.
To the Committee on Basic Education.
Resolution, PS Resolution Number 287, entitled Resolution Directing the Appropriate Senate Committee to investigate in aid of legislation the high-handed, arrogant, and irresponsible acts of one Angeline Siwen Tam, a foreign national doing business in the Philippines for the purposes of reviewing current laws in order to prevent similarly minded persons from bullying and misleading Philippine government agencies and officials, and declaring Angeline Siwen Tam as persona non grata, introduced by Senator Pimentel III.
Referred to the Committees on Public Services and Foreign Relations. There is additional reference to business.
Additional reference of business bills on first reading, Senate Number 1272, an act amending Republic Act Number 10121, otherwise known as the Philippine Disaster Risk Reduction and Management Act of 2010, by reinforcing local government coordination and response efforts, and for other purposes, introduced by Senator Tolentino.
Referred to the Committees on National Defense and Security and Local Government.
Senate Number 1273, an act establishing the revised charter of the Government Service Insurance System, introduced by Senator Revilla Jr.
Referred to the Committees on Government Corporations, Civil Service, Ways and Means, and Finance.
Senate Number 1274, an act creating the province of Western Maguindanao, introduced by Senator Revilla Jr.
To the Committees on Local Government and Electoral Reforms.
Senate Number 1275, an act creating the Taal Volcano Rehabilitation and Development Commission, establishing the Taal Volcano Rehabilitation and Development Fund for the purpose of extending aid, relief, resettlement, rehabilitation, livelihood, and development programs and services to communities adversely affected by the Taal Volcano eruption, and for other purposes, introduced by Senator Recto.
Referred to the Committees on National Defense and Security, Local Government and Finance.
Senate Number 1276, an act adjusting the minimum amount for death indemnity, moral and exemplary damages under Republic Act Number 386, or the Civil Code of the Philippines, introduced by Senator Drilon.
To the Committee on Justice and Human Rights.
Senate Number 1277, an act augmenting the employee benefits for the solicitors of the Office of the Solicitor General by providing retirement, death, and survivorship benefits and appropriating funds therefor, introduced by Senator De La Rosa.
To the Committees on Civil Service, Justice, and Finance.
Resolutions, PS Resolution Number 288, entitled Resolution Directing the Appropriate Senate Committee to conduct an inquiry in aid of legislation on the impact and effectiveness of Republic Act Number 10121, or the Philippine Disaster Risk Reduction and Management Act of 2010, and existing interagency coordination mechanisms and measures of the national government, the local government units, and the private sector in disaster risk reduction, response, and recovery in the country, with the end in view of strengthening disaster risk reduction, response, and recovery and management plans and programs of the government through appropriate legislation, introduced by Senator Gatchalian.
Referred to the Committees on National Defense and Local Government.
PS Resolution Number 289, resolution urging the Government Service Insurance System, the Social Security System, and the Home Development Mutual Fund to extend calamity or emergency loans to and/or impose a one-year moratorium on loan amortizations of members who are residents of the Taal Volcano eruption calamity areas, the local government units to be more lenient to affected businesses on the payment of real property taxes, renewal of business permits, and imposition of penalties, and the private and government banks to defer loan payments of affected borrowers, introduced by Senator Gatchalian.
To the Committees on Government Corporations, Local Government, and Ways and Means.
PS Resolution Number 290, resolution urging the immediate release of funds for the aid, relief, resettlement, rehabilitation, livelihood development, and social programs and services to communities adversely affected by the Taal volcano eruption, and directing the appropriate Senate committee to immediately call the National Disaster Risk Reduction and Management Council for a Senate briefing to assess the situation and determine the needs of the affected localities and the total budget requirements to address the calamity, introduced by Senator Recto.
To the Committee on Finance and National Defense. Majority Leader.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, in compliance with Section 26 of Republic Act 10121, which is the Philippine Disaster Risk Reduction and Management Act of 2010, the request also of the Chairman of the Committee on National Defense, Senator Panfilo Lacson, I move, Mr. President, to constitute the Oversight Committee of the said measure, Mr. President. May I ask the Chairman on who he would want to designate as members of his committee?
Senator Lacson is recognized.
I move that the following be made members of the Joint Congressional Oversight Committee on Republic Act 10121. For the majority, Senators Tolentino, Senator Ronald Bato de la Rosa, and Christopher Bongo, Mr. President. And since under the law, under the Act, under the provision of the Act, the minority shall have at least 2 members, and since there are only 2 members, not including the minority leader who's already an ex officio member, can I recommend, with the permission of the minority leader, I recommend or I move that Senator Kiko Pangilinan and Senator Risa Ontiveros be made as members.
And your honor as chairman.
And this representation as chairman,
Yes.
Mr. President.
All right. Hearing no objection, the enumerated names are hereby designated or elected as members of the Oversight Committee.
Thank you, Mr. President. With that, we move to resume consideration for Senate Bill number 1083. This is an act amending certain provisions of Republic Act 9372, otherwise known as the Act to Secure the State and Protect Our People from Terrorism. May we recognize the sponsors, Mr. President, may we recognize Senator Panfilo M. Lacson, and to interpolate a distinguished minority floor leader, Senator Franklin M.
All right. The consideration of the measure is in order. Senator Lacson, chairman of the Committee on National Defense, is recognized, and the minority leader for the interpolation, Senator Frank Rilon.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Will the gentleman from Cavite, the sponsor of the measure, yield to further questions on this proposed measure?
This is a continuation of the suspended interpellation of the distinguished minority leader. Willingly, Mr. President.
Thank you very much, Mr. President, and once more, allow us to spread into the record our commendation to the gentleman from Cavite for exerting effort in order to amend the present Human Securities Act, which admittedly can stand improvement and would have to respond to what we have experienced in this area in the last several years since its enactment. We find this measure the most significant portion of the measure, Mr. President, is the definition of acts of terrorism under Section 4 of the measure. This is important because it defines the crime that is sought to be punished under the law. And the first issue we note is that by the definition of the Terrorist Act, it includes any person. This is found on lines 20 and 21 on page 5. By this definition of any person that is punishable, that is covered by this act, this would include state actors or agents of the law. Is that a correct definition, sir?
That is a correct definition because it states any person.
Yes.
Without exception, Mr.
Yes.
President.
Is that the intention, sir? That it would include any person? I mean, it would include members of the armed forces, just for the record.
As long as they fall under the categories as stated in the succeeding paragraphs, Mr. President.
All right. Yes. We have to examine this closely, Mr. President, because this is a criminal act. And therefore, as the sponsor, being the former chief of the Philippine National Police, would agree, we must have a precise legal definition. Otherwise, the police agencies would find difficulty in providing the kind of evidence to the prosecutor in order to prosecute the crime. Now, in international law, there is yet no precise definition of terrorism.
That is
that
correct. There are at least 10 definitions. As a matter of fact,
I'm sorry?
there are at least 10 definitions of terrorism, Mr. President.
From my readings, there are about over 100 definitions.
Okay, over 100.
Over 100 definitions of what constitutes terrorism.
There are over 109 definitions.
109.
Stand corrected, Mr. President.
We are reading the same material, Mr. President.
Wikipedia.
Now, Mr. President, the definition of terrorist acts under page 5, 6, 7 of the measure would clearly define when it is applicable to ordinary crimes, to an act of terrorism, or the measure, or freedom fighters. In other words, the difficulty of the definition of anti-terrorism is that it's either an ordinary crime, an act of terrorism, or acts committed by freedom fighters. Would the gentleman agree with that?
It all depends on the intent and the purpose of the act,
That's
Mr.
correct.
President.
Yes, the purpose of the act, and I agree with that. That is why, by definition, on page 7, lines 6 down, it's very clear that when the purpose of such act, by its nature or context, is to intimidate, put in fear, force, or induce the government or any international organization or public to do or abstain from doing any act or seriously destabilize, etc., etc. Now, in the United States, the statute that defines terrorism clearly indicates that it is the use of violence or threat of violence in the pursuit of political, religious, ideological, or social objectives. Would that standard be applied also to the proposed measure, which would distinguish it from an ordinary criminal?
That could qualify, but not necessarily, Mr. President, because we are bound by the purpose of the act being committed.
Well, precisely in the United States statute, the purpose is in pursuit of political, religious, or ideological objectives. Would this be the same purpose that would qualify the act as an act of terrorism under our proposed measure?
We removed that provision actually, Mr. President. We did
So-
not apply. We are not applying the provision under the U.S. statute, under the definition of terrorist or terrorist act, Mr. President.
So that for purposes of we spread to the record, that it need not be that the act of terrorism need not be in pursuit of a political, religious, ideological, or social objective.
That is correct, Mr. President. And in lieu of that, we substituted the purpose of the act by its nature and context. It must be committed to, one, intimidate, put in fear, force, or induce the government or any international organization or the public to do or to abstain from doing any act. Or number two, seriously destabilize or destroy the fundamental political, economic, and social structures of the country. And number three, create a public emergency or undermine public safety, Mr. President. So we substituted what are stated under the U.S. statute.
There is an effort to broaden
That is correct,
the
Mr.
applicability so that it need not be
Yes.
for political, religious, ideological, or social objectives. So that need not be alleged in the information and not proven in the course of the trial that this is the purpose.
That is correct, Mr. President.
Yes. In fact, this definition is more consistent with the pending convention in the UN, the proposed international convention or the International Comprehensive Terrorism Convention, which does not indicate that political motivation is essential.
Exactly, Mr. President.
Yeah. Now, under the proposed definition in the Comprehensive Terrorism Convention, the purpose is only when the purpose of the conduct by its nature or context is to intimidate a population or compel a government or international organization to do or abstain from doing any act. And that is, in substance, adopted in the proposed measure. Is that correct?
That is correct, Mr. President.
Now, what bothers me in this definition, Mr. President, I have no problems with the way on Section 4, which on Section 4 of the measure, the definition of what constitutes terrorist acts are basically based on the proposed convention. But letter E, Mr. President, that is in the measure, that is threats to commit any of the acts listed in paragraphs A to D in this section is not included in all these conventions. And to me, this poses a little difficulty because, Mr. President, allow me to explain. If you relate this section 4 to section 6, section 6 is a terrorist act, attempt or conspiracy to commit terrorist act. It says, any attempt to commit any of the acts defined and penalized under Section 4 of this act shall be penalized by life imprisonment without the benefit of parole and Pardo and benefits, the benefits under Republic Act number 10592. When you combine these two provisions, you will come up with a crime called attempted threat to commit terrorism, which is a little difficult for me to accept, and we'll find difficulty defining what is an attempt to threaten.
Actually, Mr. President, I already read your mind before we even rose to the podium. And I'm willing to bargain to remove the word attempt.
Thank you very much, Mr. President, because that really confuses. Thank you for that response, so we can remove that letter E.
At the proper time, Mr.
At the
President.
proper time, so that it can make the definition more precise. Also included in the definition is when the purpose of the act is to seriously destabilize or destroy a fundamental political, economic, or social structures of the country. This qualification is not found in the proposed convention. What exactly does this mean?
That's still on Section 4, Mr. President.
Yes, still on Section 4, on page 7, lines 9 to line 11 first. In other words, it is an act of terrorism where the purpose of such act, by its nature and context, is to
Destroy, destabilize, or destroy the fundamental political, economic, or social
yes,
structures.
as we said, this is not found in the proposed convention. May we be benefited by an explanation for the record on exactly what this means if a prosecutor would want to prosecute a crime under this definition?
This particular provision, Mr. President, or portion of the purpose, we call this from the different provisions of other Asian countries or ASEAN countries. This is a combination of all available anti-terrorism acts in other countries, particularly ASEAN countries, Mr. President. And we got this particular provision from most of the ASEAN countries' anti-terrorism statutes, Mr. President.
The reason why we are asking that, Mr. President, is that the qualification is broad, a little bit broad to our mind. What kind of evidence would be, or what kind of acts would fall under the description of seriously destabilizing or destroying fundamental political, economic, or social structures of the country?
Well, if businesses cannot function anymore or cannot do their usual activities anymore because of threats of terrorism or terrorist acts itself, then that could fall under this category, Mr. President. Or if a government, say, the Senate as an institution cannot function because of a terrorist act or a threat of a terrorist act, then that would affect the fundamental political structure of the country, Mr. President. Or even the stock exchange. If it is subject of a terrorist act, then
Yes.
it will hinder or even affect adversely the economic activity or activities of that country. In this case, of the
Yes,
Philippines,
Mr. President, isn't that covered by the preceding line, which would intimidate the public to do or abstain from doing a particular act?
It may be different, Mr. President, because in the preceding paragraph, it involves the public at large. But in this case, we are hampering the business activities of, as I mentioned earlier, the business activities of stock exchange, for example, Mr. President.
Mr. President, Senator Tolentino wishes to
Mr.
intervene.
President,
I am willing to yield the floor to him.
With
With the permission of the two gentlemen, Senator Tolentino is recognized.
Mr. President, with the sufferance of Senator Lacson, I would like to direct my questions to the interpolator, the minority leader, Mr. President.
I
If
don't
the-
think that's proper, Mr. President.
Just for
to
clarificatory
clarify.
purposes.
Just to clarify.
Just to clarify and for the information of this body, and it has been
I am not.
Well, perhaps the best way for the
Mr.
gentleman
President.
from Cavite is to make a manifestation.
Yes.
You know,
Just a point of
The
clarification, Mr. President.
interpolator is
Yes.
Senator Drilon.
Yes, Mr. President.
You want to
That
ask a
is-
question, ask
Yes,
the sponsor.
Of course, that's with if the good interpolator would like to clarify, Mr. President. Because this is germane to the issue previously discussed as regards the sovereign agent, Mr. President, which I think is very critical in Section 4 and Section 6, Mr. President. Or if the good
Mr.
sponsor
President,
can answer, I will
For
direct
an
this.
orderly proceeding, maybe the principal sponsor
Can
during the period of interpolation can
Yes.
attempt to answer, and we would react to that as an interpolator. But it's a little difficult to accept the process wherein the interpolator would be asked questions, Mr. President.
Mr. President, just for the information
Yes.
of the body and the general public, I just wish the body to be clarified regarding an item, which, of course, with the permission of the minority leader, regarding an item relative to Section 4 and Section
Go ahead,
6,
go
which
ahead,
we have
sir.
skipped.
Yes.
And if the good sponsor will answer, with more reason that I will pursue this, with the permission of the gentleman, of course. The discussion anchored on an agent acting in behalf of a state. Mr. President, if the two gentlemen would probably clarify to this representation, if an agent or a military officer or a police officer is acting pursuant to his duties, isn't it included in the state immunity doctrine? Considering that he is an agent of the state, he cannot be sued, Mr. President. Even if an act is considered as a terroristic act, he is not bound to be held in a foreign court or in a national court because he is acting in behalf of the state. Is my proposition correct from the two gentlemen?
The sponsor may react or answer.
As I responded to the distinguished minority leader earlier, the law does not exempt anyone. But the person committing the act of terrorism must be bound by the purpose as is stated under the measure, Mr. President. If the purpose is different from or outside of the mission or the mandate assigned to that particular military officer or agent of the government, then he should be likewise held accountable or criminally liable for such act of terrorism, Mr. President.
Mr. President, with the permission of
Yes.
the
Yes,
good
Mr.
sponsor, in my humble view, this bill and the law should not apply to state agents because they are governed by some other law, the penal code or the or some other act. In fact, in the United States, Mr. President, the Terrorism bill, as defined in Title 22, Chapter 38, U.S. Code number 2656, specifically excludes acts committed by includes only acts committed by non-state actors. So that a state actor, although he is liable for the crime committed, the crime is not under the anti-terror bill or law, but under another statute.
You
like
may
the
be
revised
referring
penal code.
to the Articles of War, Mr. President. If you are a member of the Armed Forces of the Philippines, then you are covered by the Articles of War instead of some criminal acts covered by the civil courts. You may
So-
be referring to that, Mr. President.
Yes. Well, because also.
But what about members of the PNP or some military or uniformed services that are not covered by the Articles of War? Does it also mean that?
Well, that is maybe the gentleman
Mr.
from
President,
committee.
perhaps the example cited by the good minority leader refers to perhaps the overall umbrella covering consular officers, diplomatic officers,
No.
which are probably exempt from suit. But there are peculiarities wherein and the good sponsor is familiar with this. There are peculiarities when our PNP officer is even made a police attaché. And as a police attaché, he has a diplomatic immunity likewise. So I'm referring, Mr. President, to the person who probably might be involved in espionage, who will later on claim that he is not part of this because he is a diplomat, and because of that, he is immune from suit, Mr. President, and therefore cannot be subjected to the provisions of this proposed bill, Mr. President. Just, I would like to clarify that, Mr. President. Or should it be expressly be stated in the proposed bill?
Mr. President, if I recall, in the last, in the previous session when this bill was calendared, I specifically asked the question of the good sponsor. It was a question asked in jest, but very applicable to what we are debating today. And I asked a specific question. Was Senator Honasan a terrorist? Remember, he was a member of the armed forces at the time that the coup d'etat was launched. And he did acts which will compel the government to do something. Now, in other words, by ordinary definition, because the law says any person, Senator Honasan would have been covered. But the gentleman from Cavite, the good sponsor, said, no, Senator Honasan would have been covered by the ordinary, by the revised penal code,
Coup d'etat.
including the coup d'etat,
Yeah.
if it was existing at that time, but not by the anti-terror law because he was a state actor. He was a member of the armed forces. That's how the debate went on. Of course, it's a matter for this body to decide later on how to precisely define this. I am just basing my questions and interpretation on the phrase any person. That means whether or not you're a state agent, a law enforcement officer, if you commit acts which fall under the definition, you can be prosecuted under the anti-terror law. That's how I understood it, Mr. President.
Did the answer of the gentleman from Cavite, Senator Lacson, did the minority leader concur with the answer, with that answer?
I don't think so, Mr. President.
No. Well, Mr. President, under the present wording of the bill,
Yeah.
Senator Honasan could have been prosecuted if this was law, because the law says any person. And,
Except that there's no retroactive effect, Mr. President.
no, I mean,
And at that time, hypothetical.
assuming that at the time they were committed, this was already in existence. By the phrase any person, Mr. President, that would include Senator Honasan. Because
if
it does
were-
not, it does not exempt state agents, meaning public officers who could be prosecuted for another crime, but not under the anti-terror bill. That's all I'm saying. It's not that you are exempting from criminal prosecution the acts committed, but the prosecution should be under another statute, not under this statute. That's all we're saying. But of course, it's a policy issue. Right now, the good sponsor is saying any person is covered. And at a certain point, the chamber would have to vote on such policy issue, Mr. President.
All right.
Mr. President, one last point before I yield the floor.
Yes.
Relative to Section 4, which I recall was exhaustively discussed during that December session. I forgot the date, and it has something to do with the unlawful acts committed in or outside of the Philippines, Mr. President.
Yes, we will come into that later.
Just one last question, Mr. President, before I yield the floor. This is something to do with the long-arm statute and the possibility of this jurisdiction serving summons or placing into its jurisdiction persons outside the territory of the Philippines, Mr. President. I did my research during the Christmas break, and for the information of this body, it appears, and perhaps the Committee on Foreign Relations should take cognizance of this, that the Philippines is not even a signatory to a very important convention, not related to criminal law, but civil or commercial matters, and it is entitled the Hague Convention on Service Abroad of Judicial and Extrajudicial Documents, Mr. President. What I'm trying to say, Mr. President, is how do we acquire jurisdiction of a person outside of the Philippines who apparently is planning to commit or attempting to commit any terroristic act if we cannot even serve the necessary processes or documents to acquire jurisdiction over that person, Mr. President. And to highlight the matter, Mr. President, we are very familiar with the Gon case, which involves a Brazilian president of Nissan who was prosecuted in Japan, went to Turkey, and then finally settled in Lebanon. And even Japan, with the help of the Interpol, cannot acquire jurisdiction over Mr. Gon, who apparently posted bail in Tokyo and then escaped before Christmas, Mr. President. So I'm looking at the administrative difficulty of enforcing Section 4 insofar as acts committed outside of the Philippines, Mr. President. That's my last question, and if the good sponsor or if the minority leader can help clarify this predicament on how our courts will acquire a long-arm jurisdiction over a person outside the Philippines is for us to really analyze, Mr. President.
Well, the answer to that is yes, yes and no. No, if it's outside of the jurisdiction of the country, the Philippines, then we cannot acquire jurisdiction. But once he steps into our territory, then we can acquire jurisdiction under the proposed provision in this measure, Mr. President. And as we also mentioned last December, we are applying the territoriality principle. And you yourself clarified that when you interjected, that we can actually acquire jurisdiction over foreign terrorists, but only when they step on the shores of the country, Mr. President.
One last point, Mr. President. In terms of the prescription of crimes committed here, because we might reach a point, Mr. President, that the perpetrators might be in the Philippines, the other conspirators might be outside of the Philippines, and the period of prescription for those outside of the Philippines will start only once we acquire jurisdiction, once the courts acquires jurisdiction. So we might be placed in an administrative dilemma wherein some of the co-conspirators are already in jail and then or perhaps released, or perhaps the crime was prescribed. But for the other participants coming from outside of our territory, it will only commence once they enter our territory, Mr. President. Am I correct? So this would entail a very difficult administrative, judicial, prosecutorial proceedings insofar as our criminal justice system is concerned, Mr. President.
I think the law on prescription will apply. For capital offenses, it's 20 years. So if that terrorist does not come to our country to be prosecuted, then, and after a lapse of 20 years, then the crime against him shall be prescribed. I hope I'm correct with my response, Mr. President.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you for the two gentlemen for allowing me to interject. I just have some administrative nuances that probably I will expound during the period of amendments, especially as regards the jurisdiction on criminal cases and the long-arm jurisdiction of our courts, if there is any, Mr. President. I'd like to thank the two gentlemen. Salamat po.
Anything that will enhance this
Thank you.
measure is of course welcome, Mr. President.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you for the gentleman from Cavite, Senator Tolentino. Mr. President, on the issue of extraterritoriality, a cardinal principle of criminal law is that the criminal law applies only within the territory of the state which enacts this criminal law. I repeat that, Mr. President. As a general principle, penal statutes are only applicable within the territory of the state which promulgates the criminal statute or enacts the criminal statute. An exception is extraterritoriality, meaning that even if the offense was committed outside of the country which enacts the law, that law can be extended extraterritoriality, or the principle of extraterritoriality, even on those acts committed outside of the jurisdiction. And under our revised penal code, there are very specific application of extraterritoriality when the code can be made to apply. As for example, when an offense is committed while on Philippine ship or airship, where it is to counterfeit a currency note of the Philippines, or where the acts are committed by public officers in the exercise of their functions. So there is a point of contact with the Philippines. My problem with the way the present law is worded, it does not anymore require points of contact with the Philippines, so that it may, with due respect to the good sponsor, it can lead to absurd situations and the administrative difficulties which the good gentleman, Senator Tolentino, mentioned. Just to cite an example, sir. A Malaysian who plans to commit a terrorist act in Indonesia and crosses the border to Indonesia would have nothing to do with the Philippines. When he comes to the country, he can be charged and sentenced to life imprisonment. It's a little difficult, apart from the overextension of the principle of extraterritoriality, which is premised on the interest of the state being prejudiced by an act outside of its jurisdiction. That is the principal premise. Here, even if the Philippines has nothing to do with it, they are the person who commits a terrorist act can be liable for life imprisonment. In the previous period of interpolation, the good gentleman from sponsor said, we do not want to be a party, or we want to make sure that we do our share as our obligation to the community of nations, that we should punish those guilty of terrorist act, even if there has no relation to the Philippines. If that is the purpose, Mr. President, would the gentleman agree to first limit the extraterritoriality exception to those which are enumerated in the revised penal code and under section 58 of the present law? But, Mr. President, instead of a criminal offense, once the terrorist comes to our country, he is stopped at the border and deported to the place where he committed the terrorist acts.
The distinguished minority leader is correct, no? Because in the customary international law scheme of jurisdiction, the territoriality principle serves as the basic principle of jurisdiction. Exceptionally, however, Mr. President, national laws may be given extrajudicial application, provided that these laws could be justified by one of the recognized principles of extraterritorial jurisdiction under public international law. Active personality principle, the passive principle, protective principle, and universality principle. And because of the global nature of terrorism, we can apply the universality principle to cover even foreign terrorists who have committed acts of terrorism outside of the Philippine jurisdiction. That's what we are applying here, Mr. President. To apply the provisions of the revised penal code may be too delimiting, Mr. President.
Well, again, this is a policy issue. I believe that as a lawyer, I cannot subscribe to that proposal, and even considering the administrative difficulties of pointed out by Senator Tolentino. You can imagine, Mr. President, how difficult it is to gather evidence abroad in order to prosecute this case in our jurisdiction. I think we will be fulfilling our obligation if we make sure, if we exert every effort and make sure our laws would allow us to hold in our borders a terrorist and deport him or her to the country where he or she is facing a case for anti-terror acts, rather than prosecuting it here with all the difficulties attendant to such prosecution. We would rather, I think it is more effective if we deport the person to the country where the acts were committed, because you can imagine, Mr. President, if we incarcerate him here, it is entirely possible that it becomes his base to recruit Filipino terrorists. So that is why our humble suggestion is that, yes, if these are foreign terrorists, comes to the shore of the country, to the border, do not allow him entry. Deport him immediately to the country where he is facing criminal charges. In fact, and the gentleman from Cavite should be fully familiar with this, being the former chief of the Philippine National Police, that there are so-called red alerts when defendant or an accused in a foreign country comes to our shores, and the Interpol red alert is on record, to deport him immediately. To me, that's a policy consideration would dictate that we should follow that same process because of the difficulties and that we would encounter. And, Mr. President, regrettably, I cannot agree that even if no element of the crime concerns the Philippines, we can impose a life imprisonment here, because in the first place, we may not be even able to prove this offense because of the difficulty of the evidence. And because once, you know, if I were counsel for the terrorist, a foreign terrorist, the first thing I'll do is ask for a speedy trial. And if the prosecution cannot present evidence, then that terrorist is released. And the difficult deportation proceedings would have to be instituted. Anyway, Mr. President, that's...
May I respond, Mr.
Yes,
President?
please, Mr. President.
Times have changed, Mr. President. Terrorism is a new phenomenon. And having said that, the revised penal code does not contemplate, because it was passed in 1932.
Yes.
And terrorism was non-existent, never heard of at the time, Mr. President. So to limit the the definition or the coverage of terrorist acts within the provisions of the revised penal code would be a disservice to the safety of our people, Mr. President, to the security of our people.
No. It is, what we're talking here is the principle of extraterritoriality.
That is correct, Mr. President.
The applicability of the law outside of our jurisdiction. Because the general principle is you apply it only, the laws apply it only to the, within the territory of the enacting state. The exception is extraterritoriality. Whether or not it's terrorism or another crime, that principle will still apply. Extraterritoriality. It's not because of a particular crime, but anyway.
We are only introducing the extraterritoriality principle in the proposed measure, Mr. President. In ordinary crimes, we are not.
I know, yes, but may we know why we are making an exception or removing all the conditions, basically from the application of extraterritoriality in case of terrorism? Because under the present law, there is a provision which allows extraterritorial application.
We are not removing, Mr. President. We
No.
are
Huh?
precisely including
No, sir.
or
You-
applying the principle
Yes.
of territoriality,
Sir,
Mr. President.
on page 56 and 57 of the bill, the section 58 of the present law on extraterritorial application of the act is bracketed and therefore proposed to be deleted.
Let me check, Mr. President.
Yes, please. We can have 1 minute suspension, Mr. President.
Session suspended.
Yeah. Yeah. In-expand natin. Ready to resume, Mr. President.
Session resumed.
We bracketed that particular provision because it's too limiting, Mr. President. It delimits the power of the state. And precisely, we bracketed that to replace that with a new provision
No,
that would expand.
yes. You bracketed it, Mr. President, and inserted the phrase "in or outside."
In or out.
In, out, inside, or outside of the Philippines.
That is correct.
Without any qualification whatsoever. Without any qualification whatsoever. So that we can prosecute everybody. I mean, we can prosecute anyone, a member of the ISIS, a member of the terrorists in Indonesia, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But one thing that you will see is that we cannot enforce administratively this power because and all the what I would like to point out and support the administrative difficulties pointed out by Senator Tolentino is that, you know, there are, if the terrorist acts are committed by different states, in different states, how do we propose to prosecute this under the principle of extraterritoriality? In other words, the act does not in any way compel the Philippine government to do any particular act, because it has nothing to do with the Philippines. But we are imposing, if convicted, a life imprisonment, which is a little stretched. I repeat, we are punishing somebody for committing a terrorist act which has nothing to do with the country, and would even punish by life imprisonment a person guilty of terrorism who would cross borders, so that a member of the ISIS who would cross to...
I'm glad you mentioned ISIS, Mr. President. A case in point, what do we do to a Filipino who goes abroad, joins the ISIS, and comes back here?
Yes?
So we'll just let him go,
No.
Mr. President?
We deport him to the place.
But he's a Filipino, Mr. President. How can
So
we
what?
deport a Filipino?
No, because we have,
We cannot deport
no,
a
Mr.
Filipino,
President,
Mr.
I disagree with that. That is why we have treaties, ano tawag na?
Extradition.
Extradition treaties. And depending on the terms of the extradition treaty, you can have your own citizens deported to a foreign country to face the criminal case filed in that other country. I will repeat, the mere fact that you are a Filipino does not exempt you from being deported, from being brought to the country, to the other country where you have committed a crime. That is what extradition treaty is all about.
But what if the person, the Filipino, did not commit any crime from that country?
No.
He just made himself a member of some organization
Terrorist organization that is proscribed, then that's already a criminal act, Mr. President.
here in the Philippines,
Even abroad.
No,
even abroad.
Yes.
In what country? In all of the countries abroad?
Countries where the laws on terrorism provides for proscription of terrorist organizations, then just being a member is already a criminal act, Mr.
All right.
President.
What if he comes from a country that
We cannot
does not
deport him,
prescribe?
Mr. President. We can extradite him.
Yes. You cannot.
extradite him.
But
You can extradite
For
him, but-
example, in that example, Mr. President, assuming that in the United States, an organization is deemed a terrorist organization, and the Filipino joins that organization, then we can deport him to the United States.
All right. All right. What if the Filipino is in Iran
What?
or Syria
And then,
and he joins a terrorist group there, and then he comes over to the Philippines?
in my, the remedy that I am proposing is that if it is a crime in the place where he came from, we should
No.
arrest him
Mr.
at the
President,
border.
In my example, he is not. He did not commit a crime in this in that particular place. I'm just using Syria as an example, but what if he did not commit any crime? Terrorism is not illegal in that particular country, and he comes over to the Philippines. He is now a member of that certain terrorist group.
Well, Mr. President, a few years back, we repealed the anti-subversion law, which punished a person by a simple membership in the Communist Party of the Philippines. That was a principle that we have accepted, that mere membership in any subversive organization is not punishable. Now,
Yun.
we can debate on that here, where the terrorist organization is based in the Philippines. But if the terrorist organization is based abroad, I do not see, and I cannot accept that territoriality principle would be made to apply. As we said, the better remedy could be, in our mind, not allow the entry of the foreigner in our shores, deport him to the place where the...
What we are, with the permission of the
Yes.
minority leader, what we are trying to avoid here is to make the Philippines a safe haven
I
for
know.
terrorists.
We know.
What if the country where the Filipino came from does not have an extradition treaty with the Philippines? What will we do with the Filipino, Mr. President?
Mr.
And he is
President,
here
Yes.
to commit the crime of terrorism precisely because he's already a member of a terrorist organization like the ISIS, which happened in Marawi City.
Well, in Marawi City, that's not a good example, Mr. President, because there were acts of
without
terrorism.
the actual terroristic activities perpetrated there, members of ISIS who landed in Marawi to plan to commit terrorism, we cannot do anything about them because of the absence of this provision, Mr. President. And
Well-
we're trying to be proactive.
We accept that, Mr. President, but the purpose of being proactive to our mind can be served if we exclude the criminal or the terrorist from our territory. If he is a Filipino, then we can bring him to the jurisdiction of where he faces this crime. Anyway. Well,
Yes, but,
because if he recruits here, Mr. President, that is already a terrorist under
you're-
our proposal. We are talking about acts committed outside of the Philippines. Those, if he is recruited here, he commits a crime here. Right? If he's recruited here, he
But
commits
if
a
he
crime
goes
here.
abroad
No,
and becomes a member in Syria, for example, and then we do not have extradition treaties with Syria.
Syria.
But he is here now in the Philippines. He
And he's
arrived
a
here. He's a
Filipino.
member
well,
of a...
he can be prosecuted here.
Here, yes,
Yes,
precisely.
because he committed the crime here when becoming a member of a proscribed.
Okay, then we
organization.
concur with the answer then.
Mr. President, again, with the permission of the two gentlemen, just a
Maybe the good gentleman, Senator Tolentino, can avail of the period of interpolation at the appropriate time, so that our train of thought will not be interrupted.
No, this is part
just
of-
as a matter of better procedure.
Mr. President, just one liner, Mr. President. Relative to the crimes committed outside, perhaps the good sponsor, with your respect, should be made aware of the current trend that most Latin American countries have now what they have blocking statutes. Meaning to say, if you file a case against a Nicaraguan in the United States, the Nicaraguan court will not assume jurisdiction if you file again another case against that Nicaraguan national. And that goes the same with citizens coming from Costa Rica, Guatemala, Ecuador, Dominican Republic, and I've said Nicaragua. What these Latin American countries are doing is this. You file the case against in the United States as the forum, we will no longer assume jurisdiction because the United States has more resources. Go ahead, try it in the United States. But here we are, with your respect, in our proposed bill, we are willing to assume more cases to be filed in our home courts, so to speak, though we might lack the resources. This is, I think, with due respect, Mr. President, against the current trend of unloading cases and giving it to courts, to forum, with more resources, such as the United States. They can try in their federal courts the terrorist, and the Latin American countries will no longer accept that, Mr. President. So I'm looking at the situation wherein we file a case against a Nicaraguan terrorist, and thereafter the evidence sprouted in Nicaragua. Nicaragua will no longer accept that, and it probably will undermine our own case, Mr. President. So just a manifestation to further highlight the difficulty of having a long-arm statute with grave administrative difficulties, Mr. President. Salamat po, Minority Floor Leader. Salamat, good sponsor.
Yes, Mr.
I
President.
would like to posit a question, a situation, Mr. President. What if a Filipino participated in the planning of a terroristic act in the Philippines, abroad, with the assistance of some foreign terrorists? So, with your proposition, we cannot do anything about him when he comes back to our country, having planned the terrorist act to be perpetrated in the Philippines abroad.
No, Mr. President. He could be prosecuted here.
And we should
even
wait
if he
for him
planned
to
it abroad,
consummate.
because it
He
involves
could-
the Philippines.
That is correct, Mr. President.
So therefore, the extraterritoriality is squarely applicable because there is a point, there is a touch point, what do you call it? A contact point, the Philippines. That's all that we're saying, because the way it is phrased now under the bill, our courts become, can have acquired jurisdiction over all acts of terrorism all over the world.
That is correct, Mr. President.
Well, so it's a little difficult to accept that, Mr. President, because simply it runs contrary to the basic principles of territoriality. Anyway, Mr. President, we will be submitting this amendment in the course of the course of the period of amendment, because apparently the sponsor is not willing to yield this particular point.
Well, I cannot accept that an ISIS member, a Filipino ISIS member, trained abroad, would come back to the Philippines and will just welcome him, not doing anything
No,
to
Mr.
proactively prevent any possible act of terrorism. That's what I cannot accept,
Yes.
Mr. President, because it entails loss of lives, Mr. President,
Mr.
destruction of properties, destruction of the economy, the destruction of the political structure, the fundamental political structure of the country. Shall we wait for the act to be consummated before we act, Mr. President?
No, Mr.
Knowing
President. No,
fully
Mr.
well
President, we are not waiting for that.
That
We
the-
will not be waiting for that. The moment he becomes a member of ISIS, which under the conventions
Yes.
are considered a terrorist organization, once he joins that
and then comes back to the
and
Philippines,
comes back to the Philippines, we can,
he can be arrested.
We can protect ourselves by not allowing him entry into our borders and deport him to a place.
Mr. President, that
Yes.
if we are able to monitor that he's coming back, but if we are not able to monitor him coming, he has already come back, he's already has already mingled with
Pass
the
through
community.
the back door.
Well,
What can we do, Mr. President? Kill him?
no, Mr. President. We're talking here about principles of territoriality
That is
and
correct.
extraterritoriality. The first principle is that a criminal statute is only applicable and enforceable within the borders of the country which enacted the law. Exception, extraterritoriality. But therefore, the exception must be fully understood and qualified, because it is an exception to the territoriality principle under our criminal laws. So that is all that we're saying. And we're saying that in order to justify the applicability for acts committed outside of the country, it must have a point of contact with the Philippines, whether the plan is against a Philippine official or committed on board a Philippine ship. We should have that principle of extraterritoriality present, because refusal or our system that would make us the venue for terrorist acts all over the world is simply not something that, as a principle, we can agree with, Mr. President.
That's the reason why I enumerated the different principles of territorial, under the territoriality principle, Mr. President. Active, passive, protective, and universality. And any of those principles can apply.
Mr. President, on the questions raised about a Filipino citizen, the international law, particularly on conflict of laws, would allow jurisdiction over acts committed outside of the borders by the citizen of that country on the principle of a nationality theory, which accords jurisdiction to the country where the criminal is each citizen. That would apply.
Active unit.
And in the
Active.
enumeration, maybe what we can do is amend section 58 of the present law by including as a application of the principle of extraterritoriality, where the terrorist act is committed by a Filipino.
How about if it was committed by a foreign terrorist who would come to the Philippines, Mr. President?
If it is committed by a foreign terrorist abroad with no point of contact for the Philippines, the principle of territoriality will apply. And if he comes to the Philippines, the remedy should be to deport him and not allow entry into the country, rather than letting him undergo trial in our jurisdiction when we have nothing to do with it. I think we fulfill our international obligation by denying him entry. Now, if it's a Filipino, we can agree to the proposition that if he's a Filipino who committed terrorist acts outside by the nationality theory, we can prosecute him here. But
I'm
not,
afraid.
Yeah.
I'm afraid there will be situations that will be too late to act, Mr. President. That foreign terrorist may have already committed a terrorist act before we even proceed with the deportation proceeding.
No, Mr. President, because as he enters our border, he is immediately deprived of liberty.
If we're able to detect and monitor him,
Well,
Mr. President.
but that's precisely, well, the same concern would be on a foreign terrorist who...
I'm referring to a foreign terrorist, Mr. President.
No, because this would apply to all. Whether
To all,
a foreign terrorist who commits an act of terrorism outside of the country with no relation to the Philippines, or he even crosses borders internationally, would be liable for life imprisonment here. It has nothing to do with the Philippines.
Yeah.
I think I'm lost. I agree with everything that the minority floor leader said, but I just want to clarify. Are we talking about a foreign terrorist who commits an act of terrorism abroad,
Yes.
comes in here? The minority floor leader is correct. He will immediately be deported. He will not be allowed here.
Yes.
But if he gets in here, he has already violated a terrorism provision
Yes, that is
here
correct.
in our country.
Yes.
Even if he is a foreign terrorist who attacks another
That is
country.
correct, Mr. President.
Is that the principle that you're trying to
Yes, Mr. President.
So, Mr. President,
Under the territoriality principle. That is correct, Mr. President.
No, that is not it.
I just want to be clarified, because if he committed an act against a foreign entity abroad, under the principle of this act, any Filipino or foreigner who commits an act in or outside the Philippines is liable, correct?
That is correct, Mr.
Right.
President.
We are amenable to punishing him as if he's a Filipino on the principle of nationality.
Correct.
Now,
Follows
but-
you wherever you are.
Yes. But where he is a foreigner committing a terrorist act abroad, which targets not the Philippines,
Right.
I don't think that the principle of extraterritoriality should apply, but we are not without any remedy. Our remedy is to exclude him from our jurisdiction.
But if he comes in, I see the point of Senator Lacson. He becomes a threat because he's skilled.
Yes, he
He's a
becomes-
bomb maker. He comes in here.
He becomes a threat. That's why we have the right to exclude him at our border.
May I ask
If
a
we
question?
have a very porous country.
May
They
I
will
ask a
be able
question,
to come
Mr.
in.
President? A simple question. Is terrorism a crime against humanity and the law of nations? It is.
It
Yeah.
is, yes.
And that we should apply. Even if he commits the crime of terrorism abroad and he comes to the Philippines, then he must be prosecuted.
Under IHL law. Di ba? Under IHL law. He commits barbaric acts, kills a lot of people. He tries to come in here. We have a solemn duty if we have an international matter to arrest him, not under the terrorism law, but under IHL.
That's what we are proposing.
What?
Under this measure.
Di ba under IHL?
international
Humanitarian law.
There is no authority to arrest somebody who violates an international convention, Mr. President.
That's why we are including it in the amendment of the Human Security Act, Mr. President. We're trying to strengthen the law against terrorism.
Yes,
Expand its
but yes, I commend the effort of the good sponsor to strengthen, but we have a principle in law that we should not interpret the law to the point of absurdity. And it is our humble proposition that to make the extraterritoriality principle apply to every act of terrorism all over the world.
That is where, Mr. President, with the permission of the minority leader, I agree with Senator Lacson. Because I think if somebody, like that guy from Baghdad, that guy was bombed by the Americans, which is considered a war crime. He's training people to bomb camps of the Americans.
Yes.
And he comes to our country. What can we do about him?
Deport him.
Correct,
Yes,
I agree.
to the place
But if he
where
comes
he's
in here
facing
now,
the criminal case.
he's already here. Like the bomb
Deport
maker,
him.
Marwan.
Marwan.
Deport him.
Oh, no, but you have to arrest him first, right?
No, deport him. The moment you
The
file
moment he comes
deportation proceedings, you can already hold him in detention under our laws.
Let me argue my point a bit. We have 7,647 islands at last count, if I remember. And anybody can come in here. He becomes a clear and present danger here because he can train, he can bomb, he can maim people here. So the point here is perhaps the debate is not on extraterritoriality alone, but the very fact it is practically self-defense on the part of the country to have him arrested.
That is correct, Mr. President.
And if you put that in the terrorism law, I think that might be acceptable because, for example, in Britain, they have a lot of Muslim guys who leave their country and go to Syria, even bomb other people in Syria and other places, go through Turkey, and sometimes they're arrested. I think we should look at that because when they come back, are they arrested in Britain? I think they are.
My concern, Mr. President, if we don't include that provision, then the Philippines will be a safe haven of terrorists.
That's my point exactly.
Mag-aalis sila doon, pupunta lahat sila sa
Oo nga.
Pilipinas.
Pero ang sinasabi ko nga, our remedy, instead of prosecuting them here when the prosecution is very difficult and almost impossible, exclude them from our Philippine territory, deport them to the place where they committed the offense and where they are facing charges, and not allow them entry into the country. That's all we're saying.
I just have two problems with that. In the
Mr.
declaration
President,
principle,
maybe at the appropriate time when Senator Gordon would have the floor,
I
you
know
can
that
have
he's-
all.
now the gentleman from
Following-
the minority leader is bullying me.
Following the thesis of the minority leader, yes, indeed, that can be so, but you will have to arrest him
Yes.
Correct.
in order
Yes,
to deport him.
Yes, yes.
Ay, manlalaban yun.
I guess the point here
That's
is
a
if you
different
arrest him,
concept, Mr. President.
Well, because even when you charge him, you also have to arrest him.
Yes.
yeah.
So the point is, you can deprive that terrorist of his liberty, whether through a warrant of arrest in a case filed or through a deportation proceeding when you deport him to the country where he is facing criminal charges.
Or
In
a
any case,
special
Mr.
operation
President,
like Mamasapa,
can we
no?
ask for a suspension and few minutes
Yes.
break?
Well, to cool down the Senate plenary
No,
hall,
because, Mr. President, I fear that Senator Gordon may intervene, and it will take us another hour.
Oh, yeah. So before Senator Gordon intervenes, the chair declares a few minutes of Senate.
Before you do, sir, I just want to say that Senator Drilon and I have been friends for a long time. He has learned to grin and bear it. Thank you, thank you.
All right. Senate session suspended for a few minutes.
Ano pala kung schedule ako ng Senado ng seminar sa
Session resumed.
Thank you, Mr. President. We move to resume consideration on and interpolation of Senate Bill number 1083. And the next to interpolate, we'd like to suspend the interpolation of Senator Frank Drilon. He asked to suspend for the meantime, and then he will raise a few questions a bit later, Mr. President, in the deliberations. We'd
All
like
right,
to, yes, thank you, Mr. For the record, Mr. President, we'd like to recognize, I believe we have two colleagues who want to interpolate. One is Senator Gordon, Richard Gordon, and the other is Senator Risa Ontiveros. Ideally, it would be ladies first, but whoever comes out and may ask for 1 minute suspension, Mr. President, because they're still not in the session hall.
Session suspended.
I suspended you muna for a later date, or later time. Tito Dick na, inuuna si Tito Dick. Ikaw na muna. And then Reese after. O, sige. Ladies first, or ikaw? Make a short statement on health. It has to be.
Ninja.
So suspend muna natin ito. Si Risa daw mag-interpret.
Gusto niya kalaban ka palagi.
What is the pleasure of our gentleman here? So, tanong ko lang kay Risa dito, baka she wanted to interpolate. Will you interpolate? Okay. Boss Ping, buwas na lang daw siya. Okay. Ready to resume, Mr. President.
Session resumed.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, our colleagues had requested if they can continue the interpolation of the bill tomorrow. And therefore, we move to suspend consideration of Senate Bill number 1083. So moved.
All right, hearing no objection, consideration of 1083 is hereby suspended.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I move that we resume consideration of Senate Bill number, Senate Resolution numbers 106, 107, 108, 123, and the privileged speech on the good conduct time allowance of Senator Richard Gordon delivered on August 27, 2019. I so move.
Any objection? Hearing none, consideration is in order.
We recognize Senator Richard Gordon.
Senator Richard Gordon, Chairman of the Committee on Justice and the Blue Ribbon, is recognized.
Yes, Your Honor, we're ready to accept any interpolations.
Ninja ka? Wala na? To the junior? Mr. President,
Majority Leader.
no colleagues would wish to interpolate on the measure. We'd like to recognize the Senate Minority Floor Leaders.
The minority floor leader cannot restrain himself, Your Honor. I think we have to
Minority
give him
Leader,
some,
Senator
slack.
Frank
No,
Drilon
no,
is
no,
recognized.
just parliamentary inquiry, Mr. President.
Yes.
This report is a partial report of the resolution.
That's correct, Mr. President.
Yes, for the record, there will be another report which to complete the report on the resolution.
Yes, Your Honor.
Thank you very much, Mr. President.
All right, they place that on record.
I believe this is phase 1, phase 2. I think this is part 1, Mr. President. I didn't know.
So this is part one of the
Part
report.
1, Mr. President, that's correct. There still will be a part 2.
We'll be coming up with, the committee will be, in a future time,
Yes, Mr. President.
report a committee report on the GCTA.
That's correct, Mr.
All right.
President. I believe so. With that, Mr. President, I move that we approve. Or is there any, Mr. President, I move that we close the period of interpolation.
Any objection? Hearing none, period of interpolation is closed.
Mr. President, move to open the period of amendments and request our dear colleague if there are amendments. Are there amendments?
No, Your Honor. We have no amendments.
Therefore, I move to close the period of amendments, Mr. President.
Hearing no objection, period of amendments is closed.
With that, Mr. President, I move to adopt Senate Resolution numbers 106, 107, the committee report, rather. I
All right.
move to adopt the committee report.
Yes, any objection? Hearing none, committee report number 17 is hereby adopted by the Senate.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, some housekeeping matters. Mr. President,
Mr.
we'd like to
President.
inform, yes, I'm sorry.
Just a very short privilege
Oh, yes,
speech,
may
if
we
I may.
allow Senator Gordon, Mr. President?
Senator Richard Gordon is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to raise on a point of personal privilege, Mr. President, principally because of the rising threat of a mysterious disease called the coronavirus, a form of coronavirus that is now raging in Wuhan, China. And, Your Honor, in view of the fact that it is a novel coronavirus, first reported in Wuhan when more than 40 individuals were taken ill, apparently from their exposure in a seafood market in Wuhan. On January 2020, and this is what is disconcerting, no less than the Chinese President Xi Jinping said that it is extremely crucial to take every possible measure to combat a new coronavirus that has infected 217 people in China. At the point of the reports a week ago, no human-to-human transmission was documented. That is good. However, in the past few days, some countries have confirmed the spread of this virus. One confirmed case in Seoul, South Korea, 2 confirmed cases in Bangkok, Thailand, 1 confirmed case in Tokyo, Japan. In other countries have suspected cases, 2 suspected in Vietnam, 6 suspected in Singapore, and 1 pending further tests. In the Philippines, the Department of Health just disclosed today that it is currently investigating cases here. One is the case of a 5-year-old who traveled from Wuhan, China, and was admitted in Cebu City for manifesting fever, throat irritation, and cough prior to entering the Philippines. The DOH is also monitoring 3 individuals with flu-like symptoms upon entering the country via the Calibo International Airport from China. But without any history of travel to Wuhan and without any known contact with a confirmed 2019 novel coronavirus case, severe acute respiratory illness, or sick animals. Coronaviruses are a large family of viruses ranging from the common cold to more serious infections such as the MERS-CoV and SARS-CoV. Common signs of coronavirus are infection, including respiratory symptoms, fever, cough, shortness of breath, and breathing difficulties. In severe cases, it can cause pneumonia, Mr. President, acute respiratory syndrome, kidney failure, and even death. It is but natural that we all be concerned in the Philippines about this virus. Not only because we have heavy traffic of travelers from China, but we are on the cusp of the Chinese New Year, Mr. President, which is on January 25. And this is one of the longest holidays in China where everybody travels. Lahat ho nagbibiyahe dyan. They travel within China, and they also travel beyond China. And the Philippines is one of their favorite destinations. In 2019, there are about 1.5 million Chinese tourists in the country. In January 2019 alone, 131,196 Chinese flew to the Philippines. That is so far in January last year. This is serious and we must act swiftly and boldly. I've been informed that as we speak, there is a global emergency meeting regarding this outbreak. It is our duty to prepare for a possible spread of the coronavirus in our country. Airports and seaports need to be on full alert. Beyond this, every hospital, every health facility, public, private, or run by local governments have to put in place contingency plans for patients who are consulting for runny nose, cough, sore throat, and fever. And we should put a firewall in the hospitals, which can prevent the virus from spreading. We could also designate specific hospitals to cater to these kinds of cases. First, when they go in, they should not, if they're suspected cases, they should not be allowed to go to the main hospital. There should be an isolation ward that will receive them so it doesn't spread. We know that it can easily mutate. We can also know that in outbreaks of coronavirus like SARS and MERS, hospitals have had to close down and health workers who see the patients are at high risk for disease and even death. Unfortunately, as you may have noticed, many people are experiencing flu-like symptoms already. So what are the plans? What are the protocols for hospitals? What measures are in place to prepare for an outbreak? With more than 500,000 people also in evacuation sites in Batangas, one could imagine how a contagious virus could wreak havoc on our people who are displaced. I would like to call on the leadership of all government agencies to immediately put in place the preparedness plans for this weekend, a time of high risk traveling of people from China to all parts of the world. Information is critical, and all the mandatory quarantine and contact tracing machinery needs to be in place. Already it is in place in our major airports, but certainly we are an archipelagic country. Maaaring pumasok yan sa maliliit na bayan o sa maliliit na port natin. Let us not wait for this to go out of hand. And I'm glad that the DOH is already on hand to, they had a press conference today, and I'm happy that they're alerted to this. Let us sound the alarm now, however, and prepare for a worst-case scenario. We always must do that. Through timely preparedness, we will save lives and protect our people. Therefore, there must really be a very good communication plan so that people will not panic and will know what to do. A communication plan that would turn an unthinkable and preventable illness that could cause serious diseases and unexpected death to a better result, Mr. President. Thank you very much, Mr. President.
Majority Leader.
Mr. President, I move to refer the committee of the distinguished gentleman from Zambales, to the speech of the distinguished gentleman from Zambales, to the Committee on Health. So moved, Mr. President.
Hearing no objection, the privileged speech is hereby referred to the Committee on Health.
Do we do reference of business or itong housekeeping muna informing the body?
We have a second additional reference of business.
Yes, Mr. President, I move to proceed with the second reference, additional
The
reference.
Secretary will proceed. Second.
Second additional reference of business, bills on first reading, Senate number 1278, entitled An Act Amending Section 16 of Republic Act number 7160, otherwise known as the Local Government Code of 1991, and for other purposes, introduced by Senator Villanueva.
Referred to the Committee on Local Government.
Senate number 1279, an act strengthening technical vocational education and training in the Philippines by incorporating apprenticeship and dual training system, providing for continuous training of the unemployed, and expanding the provision of enterprise-based education and training, and for other purposes, introduced by Senator Villanueva.
To the Committees on Higher Education, Labor, Ways and Means, and Finance.
Senate number 1280, an act mandating food manufacturers to display color-coded nutritional information on food packaging and for other purposes, introduced by Senator Villanueva.
To the Committees on Health and Trade.
Senate number 1281, an act providing for the lifetime validity of birth certificates issued by the Philippine Statistics Authority and for other purposes, introduced by Senator Villanueva.
To the Committee on Civil Service.
Senate number 1282, an act integrating environmental education in senior high school's curriculum, introduced by Senator Villanueva.
The Committee on Basic Education.
Senate number 1283, an act providing scholarship to qualified students taking medical education programs, appropriating funds therefore and for other purposes, introduced by Senator Villanueva.
To the Committees on Higher Education, Health, and Finance.
Senate number 1284, an act granting disaster response volunteers leave pay to qualified employees in the government sector and for other purposes, introduced by Senator De Lima.
To the Committee on Civil Service.
Senate number 1285, an act encouraging volunteerism during emergencies by protecting volunteers from liability and providing mandatory insurance coverage to the volunteers, introduced by Senator De Lima.
To the Committees on Social Justice and Human Rights.
Resolutions. Senate Concurrent Resolution number 5, entitled Concurrent Resolution urging the Bangsamoro Transition Authority to designate its representatives to the Philippine Congress Bangsamoro Parliament Forum to be created pursuant to Article 6, Section 3 of Republic Act number 11054, otherwise known as the Organic Law of the Bangsamoro Autonomous Region in Muslim Mindanao, and to meet with the delegates designated by the Senate and the House of Representatives for the purpose, introduced by Senator Zubiri.
To the Committee on Rules.
PS Resolution number 291, resolution directing the proper Senate committee to conduct an inquiry in aid of legislation to determine the preparedness of the Philippine government on the detection, prevention, minimization, treatments, and containment measures on the reported potential outbreak of an unknown pneumonia virus in China, and the capacity of our health workers and professionals to handle said disease, introduced by Senator Villanueva.
Referred to the Committee on Health.
PS Resolution Number 292, resolution directing the Senate Committee on Cooperatives to conduct an inquiry in aid of legislation on the implementation of Republic Act Number 11364 or the Cooperative Development Authority Charter of 2019 and the formulation of its implementing rules and regulations with the end in view of strengthening the cooperative sector and the full implementation of the provisions of the law, introduced by Senator Zubiri.
To the Committee on Cooperatives.
PS Resolution Number 293, resolution directing the appropriate Senate committees to conduct an inquiry in aid of legislation on the unknown strain of coronavirus first detected in Wuhan, China, with the intention of determining appropriate measures and necessary funding requirements to ensure a quick and efficient government response to address a possible outbreak of the mysterious respiratory virus in the country, introduced by Senator Binay.
To the Committees on Health and Finance.
Committee report number 33, submitted jointly by the Committees on Public Order and Dangerous Drugs and Justice and Human Rights on PS Resolution number 47, introduced by Senator Ontiveros, entitled Resolution Urging the Senate Committees on Public Order and Dangerous Drugs and Justice to conduct an investigation in aid of legislation on the spate of killings that devastated the island of Negros and the circumstances that allowed for the lawless violence that cloaked the province, with the end in view of attaining justice for the slain victims and creating policies that will adequately address the root cause of the conflict in the province. And PS Resolution number 65, introduced by Senator De Lima, entitled Resolution Directing the Appropriate Senate Committee to conduct an inquiry in aid of legislation into the implementation of Memorandum Order number 32, otherwise known as Oplan Sauron, in relation to the recent spate of killings in the province of Negros Oriental in particular and other affected areas, recommending its adoption of the recommendations and their immediate implementation. Sponsor, Senator De La Rosa.
To the calendar for ordinary business. Majority Leader.
Sir, we have some housekeeping matters. We have been informed, Chairman, yeah. We have been informed by the House of Representatives that they officially that they will hold its plenary session tomorrow, Wednesday, the 22nd, 2020, at the Batangas City Convention Center at 1 p.m. I believe they're just asking our permission under the Constitution, Mr. President. Under the Constitution.
I think they just want to inform us.
Yeah, inform us, yes.
So
That's correct.
we place it on record. We take
Yes.
note of the manifestation of the
That's correct. For
House
the
of
record.
Representatives.
For the record. And few change of referrals, Mr. President. Senate Bill number 01, the Medical Scholarship Bill. With the consent of the body, I move that we transfer the referral of SB number 1 to the Committee on Health, from the Committee on Health, rather, to the Committee on Higher Education as primary committee. Similar bills were filed and referred to the Committee on Higher Education. And the Committee on Higher Education wants to set the hearing already, Mr. President, so,
All
for
right.
the record.
Hearing no objection. It is so recorded and so transferred.
Also, Mr. President, Senate Bill number 1259, Teacher Salary Upgrading Act. With the consent of the body, I move that we transfer the referral of Senate Bill number 1259 from the Committee on Basic Education to the Committee on Civil Service as the primary committee, since similar bills of the same nature was referred to the Committee on Civil Service.
All right, so transferred.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, just one last. Mr. President, I move that we consider, with the permission of the body, Senate Concurrent Resolution number 5. I so move.
Any objection? Hearing none. So considered.
Mr. President, we'd like to ask the Secretary to read the title of the measure.
Secretary will read the title of the resolution.
Concurrent resolution urging the Bangsamoro Transition Authority to designate its representatives to the Philippine Congress Bangsamoro Parliament Forum to be created pursuant to Article 6, Section 3 of Republic Act Number 11054, otherwise known as the Organic Law for the Bangsamoro Autonomous Region in Muslim Mindanao, and to meet with delegates designated by the Senate and the House of Representatives for the purpose.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Yes.
Mr. President, sponsor of the measure, I'm willing to take any interpellation. I believe the good chairman of the Committee on Local Governments would like to ask a few questions on the measure.
Senator Tolentino is recognized.
Yes, Mr. President, with the permission of the Majority Leader.
Yes, absolutely.
When the Bangsamoro law was passed, may I inquire if it is the intention of Congress to supersede the constitutional oversight functions of Congress over a creature of Congress itself? Because apparently, Mr. President, there is under Section 2 in said law an intergovernmental relations mechanism, which in the resolution just proposed calls for the creation of an in a Bangsamoro, in Section 3, the succeeding section, calls for the creation of a Philippine Congress Bangsamoro Parliament Forum. Am I correct to state, Mr. President, that this forum would picture Congress itself or even the Senate as a co-equal body in terms of juridical and legislative relationships would be concerned, Mr. President?
Not at all, Mr. President. Not a co-equal body, because the idea for the intergovernmental relations system or setup was really to harmonize particular programs of government. Kung may, for example, if there's a problem between the Department of Health, the Ministry of Health, with problem with BARM, with the Ministry of Health, the intergovernmental relations body, headed by their minister and our secretary, will meet to iron out these problems. But on oversight functions, Mr. President, there's no question that in the Constitution is very clear that there's oversight functions of the Congress and Senate when it comes to measures emanating from these chambers, Mr. President.
So, Mr. President, it is still correct to reaffirm and validate that in the constitutional sphere of things, executive, legislative, and judicial would still be the legal axis, so to speak, Mr. President.
Yes, and also I have here the transcript of records, the discussions during the debate. When asked by Senate President Pimentel at the time to cite an example how an issue can be resolved through the intergovernmental relations mechanism, Senator Zubiri cited how the Philippine Congress and the Bangsamoro Parliament Forum could help in the creation of, for instance, a new separate province. Also, if the Bangsamoro Parliament could approach Congress through the said forum to ask for assistance on the creation of the new LGU. So that was the idea on the mechanism. But I think to put it in proper context, the good gentleman from Cavite had approached me yesterday and basically had said that they would want to have a hearing under the Committee on Local Government on the updates on the Bangsamoro Organic Law, which I think is a very laudable hearing. I would attend it myself to also see what is going on the ground. Unfortunately, there was a letter sent to the good senator, which I also retrieved just now. Basically, the chief minister had asked that the only time that they could meet with us is through the intergovernmental relations mechanism. In other words, through the forum, which I think I would say unfortunate. I feel it's unfortunate because there's nothing wrong for them to come. We actually ask private sector to come here. We have heads of private corporations come here to shed light on particular issues. They're not even in part of government. So I think we have to relay the message, Mr. President, as a body, that that was not the intent of that particular section or that particular provision of the Bangsamoro law. We at any time can still call out a government agency to come and to shed light and to report to us what is going on in these particular agencies. Even at times we ask the executive department as well as even judiciary when we have cases and the Committee on Justice takes up issues on the judiciary, on their budget, on bills pertaining to them, the judiciary, even an independent member of government, they attend these particular hearings. So that's why this is very important, Mr. President, this concurrent resolution, because we will now form our delegates, because I want to relay this, I would like to relay this as part of the leadership and author of the measure, together with the Senate President. And as a matter of fact, I recommended the chairman of the Committee on Local Government and the chairman of the National Defense Committee, in particular, to be members of this intergovernmental body, which is the Bangsamoro Parliament Forum. Because on the first meeting, Mr. President, I would like us to inform them that that was not the intent of the creation of this body, that we can still invite them to attend our, and they should actually, we should encourage them to attend these hearings in the Senate.
So
That will satisfy the good
the proposed resolution, as crafted, would reaffirm the supremacy of Congress insofar as the constitutional mechanism is concerned,
Yes.
and that a mere creation of Congress cannot be considered as a co-equal. Perhaps in Section 3, the purpose of the law was related to the administrative details, which would remove an extra amount of time from Congress itself in convening as a body, a committee perhaps, and asking some details from the Bangsamoro entity. So we now have Section 3, which will have a Philippine Congress Bangsamoro Parliament Forum, wherein the details that would not need the intercession of the Congress or the Senate as a body would be needed. Am I correct in that
That's
interpretation,
correct,
Mr. President?
Definitely, the Constitution supersedes all measures passed by Congress.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. We may recognize the Minority Floor Leader, Mr. President.
Minority Leader, Senator Drilon is recognized.
If we can help, Mr. President, clarify the issue. If you recall, Mr. President, when the bill was passed in our chamber, it contained a lot of powers which were supposedly shared by the national government and the Bangsamoro regional government. And when we sat down in the bicameral conference committee, we pointed out that these powers being shared can cause a lot of confusion and a lot of conflict, because by the very nature of its being a shared authority power, then the two bodies, the Bangsamoro government and the national government, will try to exercise that power. So the issue was, who will resolve the dispute, or the disagreements? That is why, in the course of the bicameral conference, we said, okay, we want a clear delineation of authority. What is the Bangsamoro authority? What is the national government authority? So that we avoid this confusion. And I concur with the good gentleman from Cavite that we should not be giving up powers of Congress. And this interagency or intergovernmental? Interparliament forum, or whatever it is, should not be interpreted as a diminution of the power of Congress, because that is never the intention.
Yes.
Maybe, and by way of just to repeat, we veered away from shared powers, because precisely these intergovernment agencies would be the forum where the power is shared to discuss what will happen or how it will be resolved. So it is, in that sense, there is no more shared power, and this Congress in a Bangsamoro Legislative Forum should only be used like any committee deliberation in Congress, Mr. President. That's just to clarify.
I completely agree with the two gentlemen, Mr. President, and you know, Senate Minority Floor Leader, distinguished Minority Floor Leader, was actually in charge of the legal issues of the Bangsamoro Organic Law. Definitely, during the discussions, there was no way that we were going to diminish our powers of oversight. That was never in the intention. And for the record, we would like to put that on record during the discussions. And as I said earlier, no law that we pass here can substitute the Constitution or is higher than the Constitution of the Republic of the Philippines. Actually, we're just constituting this, Mr. President, so that we can already start the dialogue with them, and we'd like to already remind them that Congress has oversight functions. So, yun lang po siya, which is
All right.
under the Section 3 of the law.
Thank you. And I'm indeed starting to believe that you are really a tag team. No?
Di naman po. I refer
The
to,
majority leader.
there's only
the
a few,
Minority leader.
actually, because, Mr. President, you know that the minority floor leader is a legal luminary, and there's only a
Of
few
course.
legal luminaries in the Senate. So with that, Mr. President, again, I reiterate that I share the view of the good chairman of the Committee on Local Government and our distinguished minority floor leader. So with that, Mr. President, no other member wishes to interpolate, close the period of interpolation.
Any objection? Hearing none. Period of interpolation is closed.
Mr. President, with that, no amendments as well, I move to close the period of amendments. Mr. President.
Hearing no objection. Period of amendments closed.
And Mr. President, before we move to adopt, under the law, the Senate President may designate, aside from the leadership, which is the Senate President Pro Temp, Minority Floor Leader, Majority Floor Leader, you also may designate other members you see deemed fit to be part of this Parliament forum. I would make a suggestion, Mr. President, later hour, to
Right.
include our Chairman of the Committee on National Defense and the Chairman of the Local Government Committee.
I
With
will
that, Mr.
submit
President-
to your suggestion.
Thank you, Mr. President. With that, I move to adopt Senate Concurrent Resolution number 5.
Any objection? Hearing none. Senate Concurrent Resolution number 5 is hereby adopted.
Thank you, Mr. President. No other matters that will be taken up today. I move that we adjourn session until 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Wednesday, January 22, 2020. I so move.
Any objection? Hearing none. Session is adjourned until 3 o'clock in the afternoon of Wednesday, January 22, 2020.